Hey there, folks. We are just about to round out our first set of 3 videos about Star Trek Adventures role-playing game, a 2-die-20 system from Modiphius. It's a genre simulation, what some folks might call a story game. And today we're going to go into depth about the scene economy and traits, something which I think really helps cement this game as all about the Star Trek television genre and the Star Trek universe. So have a seat, grab a drink, and let the curtain draw back. If you're familiar with tabletop role-playing games, then you've probably seen how when we cover a 1,000-mile trek across a blistering desert waste, we don't cover every step along the way. We focus in on the moments where the character's water supply has run out, and things are looking grim. We focus in on the moments where they're encountering helpful or hostile locals. We focus in on the moments where they have to navigate a precipitous mountain pass. And Star Trek Adventures operationalizes the idea that play really consists of those moments where we're zoomed in by creating the scene economy. A scene begins by saying which characters are in it. You don't have to necessarily play your main character, and not every scene will feature every character. To make up for this, there's a robust set of supporting character mechanics. You can call upon a pool of supporting characters that the group has created, which might be various people throughout your starship. Or you can create one right there on the spot. And this allows you to be right there in the thick of the action, even if it's not your main character's wheelhouse. Transporter Chief Rand in the motion picture films with the original cast is a great example of one of these characters. But I would also point at Nurse Chapel, at Michael Eddington, at Ensign Rowe, and possibly even at Wesley Crusher, since he's not central to every episode all the time. So how does Star Trek Adventures define what a scene is? Well, scenes are something with a dramatic question, an uncertain outcome. They are a place where things could go either way, things that are interesting. And the game admits that this is something which will be different for different groups. And how long you want to continue these scenes after perhaps the intensity of them has abated, that's another matter. But when a scene ceases to be interesting, that's when it's over, and it's time to move to a new scene. As each scene begins, the Game Master sketches out the circumstances, describes them. If I tell you that the characters in their journey across the desert waste are coming to a place where they have to navigate a mountain pass, and the crisp alpine air is cold upon their noses, and the scree of the path that they walk upon occasionally tumbles thousands of feet below into a raging ravine, well, some of those details will affect the game state, and others won't. I could say that this precipitous height is something that is a trait. It's something that characters who have a nervousness or a fear of heights might have to confront, and it's also something that could increase the difficulty for anything athletic due to the thin air. At the same time, I could describe another trait, that unstable footing is in play. Anytime that the characters need to do something that really involves using their core muscles, there's a chance that that difficulty could be a little bit higher on those tasks. That's what traits do. They can increase the difficulty of a task, they can decrease the task's difficulty. They can make things impossible, and they can make other things possible. An example of this could be an advantage that your doctor has created, of perhaps surgically altering your crew members to look as if they were Romulans. This makes it possible, then, to disguise yourself and infiltrate a Romulan enclave. It would have otherwise been impossible, wouldn't it? At the same time, there are a number of episodes where the ship has entered into a region of closed space-time curvature, as in a pocket universe. The sky becomes dark because there are no stars in it. There are certain things about this black space that make other things impossible. Conventional navigation, for example, or moving beyond the borders. Removing this trait would mean that the trait is no longer true. And that's exactly how long traits last, until they're not true anymore. There are 3 ways of describing traits: situation traits, location traits, and character traits. A situation trait is something about the ambiance. It could be a very tense showdown between you and the Klingons over a border raid. Possibly there's been some piracy, and you are confronting one of their ships. Your crew believes that these Klingons are culpable, and these Klingons know that their honor is at stake because they're about to be accused of being corsairs. This could make the difficulty of all of the communications that much higher. It's a circumstance, basically, that makes the situation that much more flavored. Now, what if you could diffuse the tension? What if you could establish, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that these Klingons were not the pirates? Well, that would probably make that trait no longer there. A location trait is something about a place. It's something about where you are. It could be where the ship is. There's the Battle of the Binary Stars and the debris field and the glare associated with it in the new series Star Trek Discovery. Whether you like that show or not, that ambiance of that location played a central role to what happened in that premiere episode. And if the events of that episode had happened somewhere else, well, then those traits wouldn't have been there. Thus, it's a location trait. And finally, to continue referencing Star Trek Discovery at my own peril, let's talk about character traits. Michael Burnham is a complex person who's been raised on Vulcan, in spite of being fully biologically human. And it creates a lot of tension within her character. She has the human species trait. As another example, there's an episode of The Next Generation where Lieutenant Worf suffers a back injury that might make him a paraplegic for life. And while that injury is in play, that's a trait about his character. It's something that's making some things impossible and increasing the difficulty of others. The final type of trait is equipment. It might be a little different for you to think of these physical objects within the world as sort of adjectives. But after all, you can't do some things unless you're holding a tricorder. And the difficulty of beaming back up to your starship is affected by whether you have a pattern enhancer set up. When you think about how equipment ends up working, ends up functioning in the Star Trek universe and in Star Trek stories, I think it fits perfectly. If a trait is especially severe, it could be stacked up to indicate that even if it's made somewhat untrue, it still lingers on, and it makes things really a lot harder. Subspace interference 2 is something which we get sketched out in the rulebook, as in, it's that much harder. And even once you've set up an algorithm in the ship's computers to kind of work through that interference, its role is still heavily there in play. Now, there are two special types of traits that you're going to encounter and create yourself very often in Star Trek adventures. One of them is an advantage, and one of them is called a complication. They're things that characters and game masters can create and remove by acting within the economy of the momentum and threat tokens. We'll talk about that and a couple of other things within the momentum and threat economy that interact with scenes at the end of this video. But for now, let's talk about what an advantage is. It's something that's always good. It's something that is right there, that sort of has unlocked possibilities. It could be that you scanned the enemy ship and found where their exhaust ports are, and these will allow you to track them even as they move into an obscuring gas cloud. That's an advantage which is going to make possible something that was impossible. Possibly, when they're not in the gas cloud, it could even reduce the difficulty of tracking them. That sort of thing is what an advantage is, and it's paid for pretty heavily by spending 2 momentum while you're making a check associated with something related. An advantage could also be something like earning a Klingon's respect, or letting it be known that you understand their culture and that you need to be dealt with as a warrior rather than as a non-combatant. Now, complications are interesting. They're the hairy problems that crop up. After you've diverted power from non-essential systems to try and keep the shields up, it could mean that when you need a cup of coffee because you've been awake for 8 hours, it's not there for you. It could be that after fisticuffing 8 Klingons in a hallway during a boarding action, you're feeling a little worse for wear, bruised, battered, and in need of rest. And it could be that making that trait cease to be true means that you will need to get some rack time. Complications can be created by the Game Master by spending 2 threat, but better yet, they can appear in play when you roll within the complication range of a task. It's sort of just like a critical fumble in other games, and it's something that's a lot of fun because it allows you to take the narrative of the game you're playing and bring it down into the substrate of the rolling of the dice and the numbers of play. And the choices of how your group does so are how you will be very engaged with this narrative. And this is where I want to take a special moment to talk about a YouTube comment from the previous video. She was a little bit concerned that this would be game-like. These tokens, these systems that we see in Star Trek Adventures will distract from really being engaged with the narrative of play. And instead, you'll be playing this little mini-game of trying to get tokens. And what I can say in this game's defense is that, first of all, the momentum pool is constricted in size, such that it's really only the last few things that people have done that will matter to how much momentum you have available to yourself. So there's not like a strong distraction effect. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that the Game Master is the one who says when there's a task and what the difficulty of a task is. So the players earn momentum for extra successes after the GM has decided that it was something that was worth rolling dice for. What I mean to say is that Star Trek Adventures is a little bit old school, in the sense that as old school Dungeons & Dragons games sort of require the players to narrate their actions, to talk about how they're going to poke the floor with a 10-foot pole, rather than just shortcut to detecting for traps. Well, that means that I think that you really will be engaged with the fiction of this game. The trade economy, the scene economy, they're there for you so that when you discover things in those narrations that really should matter, it's very easy to make them matter. So I hope that clears it up a little bit. Now let's talk about how momentum and threat interact with the scene economy. One of those places is in the decay of the momentum pool. I talked about this before, but if a trivial scene causes the players to really accumulate a lot of momentum, as the scene ends, one of those momentum will dissipate away, because, after all, the impetus of greeting that JAG officer who's just boarded and having a successful greeting won't matter all that much to when you have a hull breach on Deck 6 because of an unexpected explosion in the cargo. And I'd also like to call back to the momentum and threat video to mention how the Game Master can introduce new dangers and new threats to a scene by spending threat tokens. It can be that as systems start to degrade on the ship that you're trying to do a rescue or stabilize the warp core aboard, it could be that a gas conduit could rupture in the corridor as your character's walking by. That can be a way that the Game Master can spend threat to increase the peril of a scene. And in fact, in this game, it's sort of important for the Game Master to do this so that the players have a sense of where their peril lies, so that they know how much momentum or even their determination to invest in it. We'll visit the idea of what determination is when we talk about characters in a future series of videos. But for now, what I want to point out is that momentum and threat interact with the scene economy, and the scene economy interacts with tasks by affecting difficulties. These are knit together. Now finally, let's talk about something that I think is a favorite of mine, which is just a way that you can end the scene as the Game Master. You can say that there's been a reversal. I'm not saying that you should do this often, but you can spend 2 threat tokens for each player's character in the scene to close the scene, and to kind of talk about how it is that things went south. Now this would cost 8 threat if you had 4 player characters in your party. And that would mean that in the following scenes, you probably wouldn't have a lot of threat. And you've also given up your chance to create threat for yourself by playing it out. So there's a lot of opportunity costs here. But in a conversation online recently, I realized that if you're fighting the Jem'Hadar, and you've accumulated a lot of lethal attacks that have built up the threat pool, if you're fighting the Klingons, if you're fighting the Borg, sometimes saying that those enemies are implacable, and that the character group had to evacuate, can bring things back into the Trek genre. You can't win a shooting match against some of these really invincible or implacable enemies. You have to find the super science or the diplomatic ways to unlock the Star Trek answers. So I'm not opposed to this feature being there, and I will stick up for its use, here and in future videos. So hopefully in this series of 3 videos, we've sketched out and kind of closed the book on what the state of play looks like in Star Trek Adventures, what it feels like to inhabit this game as a player character and as a game master. It's a different paradigm. It's one that I think is all about the camera eye of a television show. That's how I see it for myself. But it has the tools in play for you to look at it in dozens of other ways. It's a narrative system all about what happens to these player characters. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll always succeed either. The mechanic that we just talked about is one example of this. It's a real innovation for me, and at the same time, it draws upon some intense old-school elements. And all of my attempts to bring Star Trek role-playing into my tabletop role-playing life have failed for one reason or another, but this game is delivering resounding success, and I think it's because of the design. I'll be talking to you more about the design and how you can approach it, and hopefully giving you some useful tutorials like this in the future. For now, I hope that this trilogy of videos has provided a decent introduction. In the future, I think the next place we're going to go is into what a character is, what determination is, what your values are. This is a place where the characters can really enforce their will upon what's happening, and it's a place where their internal conflict also fuels the game. It's really another interesting place to go. For now, I hope you give this game a try. I'm the Complex Games apologist. No, okay, we don't need to go into that.